Tonight, the story begins long before the journey into the Underworld, long before the quiet footsteps through the kingdom of shadows, long before a single glance changed everything. There was simply a child, a mountain, and the slow turning of the seasons. In those distant years, when the ancient world still believed that rivers listened and forests remembered, there was a valley in northern Greece where mornings arrived gently. The first light did not rush over the hills. Instead, it settled softly upon the olive trees, the wild thyme, and the pale stones that had rested in the same places for generations. The people who lived there rose with the sun, not because they hurried, but because the earth itself asked them to. Farmers walked narrow paths toward their vineyards, while shepherds gathered sleepy flocks that drifted across the hillsides like small white clouds. Bakers lit their ovens before dawn, and the warm scent of fresh bread slowly wandered through quiet streets. No one believed they lived in extraordinary times. To them, each day looked much like the one before. And perhaps that was why they noticed unusual things so easily. Among those unusual things was a young boy named Orpheus. No one could agree exactly when they had first heard him sing. Some remembered him as a child no taller than a vineyard fence. Others insisted he had been older, already helping his family gather olives beneath silver-green branches. Memory has a gentle habit of changing over time, but everyone agreed on one thing. The valley sounded different after Orpheus was born. His voice was never loud. It did not command attention, it invited it. People often found themselves stopping in the middle of ordinary work without understanding why. A woman carrying water from the village spring might suddenly realize she had remained standing for several minutes, listening without moving. An old shepherd would forget to count his sheep. Children, usually restless beneath the afternoon sun, became strangely quiet. Even the village dogs seemed less interested in barking whenever distant melodies drifted across the fields. No one considered this frightening. It simply felt peaceful. The elders spoke softly among themselves. Some believed the boy had inherited a gift from his mother. Others quietly suggested that perhaps the gods had touched his life before he was even born. Such conversations were never spoken loudly. The Greeks respected mysteries. Not every question demanded an answer. Sometimes wonder was enough. As the years passed, Orpheus wandered farther from the village. He discovered narrow forest paths where pine needles covered the ground like soft carpets. He sat beside streams whose clear water carried tiny reflections of the sky. He climbed gentle hills where wildflowers moved together whenever the breeze crossed the land. There he listened. More than he sang, he listened. He listened to birds greeting the sunrise, to leaves brushing together high above his head, to insects hidden beneath stones, to distant thunder rolling slowly across mountain peaks. Most people heard these sounds separately. Orpheus heard them together. To him, the world was already making music. He simply answered it. It became common to find him seated upon a weathered rock with a simple wooden instrument resting across his knees. Its frame was modest. Its strings were few. Nothing about it suggested greatness. Travelers passing through the valley often smiled politely before continuing on their journeys. Then they heard him play. Many stopped without realizing they had done so. One merchant later claimed he had intended only to rest his tired feet for a moment. Instead, the afternoon disappeared. When he finally resumed his journey, the sun had already begun to sink toward the western mountains. He could not explain where the hours had gone, only that they had felt unusually calm. Word traveled slowly in those days, not by written letters, not by swift messengers. Stories moved from village to village inside ordinary conversations. A fisherman mentioned a remarkable musician while selling his morning catch. A shepherd repeated the story to travelers resting beside a roadside spring. Months later, someone hundreds of miles away might hear of a boy whose songs seemed capable of calming both people and animals alike. With every telling, the stories grew a little larger. As stories often do, some claimed deer approached him without fear. Others insisted wolves forgot to hunt whenever his music echoed through the forest. One sailor even swore that seabirds circled his ship in perfect silence after hearing a melody carried across the water from a distant shore. Perhaps these stories were true, perhaps they were not. Ancient Greece did not always separate history from wonder. Both were welcome companions. The seasons continued their patient rhythm. Spring covered the hills with flowers. Summer warmed the vineyards. Autumn painted the forests with soft gold. Winter wrapped the mountains in quiet mist. Year after year, always turning, always returning. The people accepted these cycles without complaint. Life was not expected to change quickly. It was expected to continue. Perhaps this is one reason the ancient Greeks valued music so deeply. Music could not stop time, but it could make time feel gentler. Festivals arrived throughout the year. Some honored the harvest. Others celebrated the sea, the changing seasons, or the many gods who watched over every part of life. Villagers gathered beneath open skies carrying baskets filled with bread, figs, olives, cheese, and dark grapes harvested only days before. Children laughed between rows of wooden tables. Old friends embraced. Musicians tuned their instruments. And eventually someone always asked Orpheus to play. He never hurried. He simply smiled, adjusted the strings, and began. Conversation faded naturally. No one demanded silence. Silence arrived on its own. Even the evening breeze seemed to soften. Fires burned quietly. The stars appeared one by one. For a little while, no one worried about tomorrow's work. No one thought about aging parents. No one counted debts or measured harvests. There was only the music, only this moment. Only the peaceful certainty that the night was exactly as it should be. Far beyond the valley, high above mortal lands, the gods were said to watch the world below. The old poets often imagined that nothing escaped divine notice. Whether this was true, no one could say. Yet stories whispered that even Apollo, lord of music and light, turned his attention toward the young musician. Not out of jealousy, not out of pride, but out of quiet curiosity. Few mortals understood harmony as deeply as Orpheus did. Whether this gift came from the gods or from years spent listening to forests and rivers mattered very little. The result remained the same. His music belonged everywhere. As Orpheus grew older, travelers noticed something else. His songs were changing. The melodies had become deeper, gentler, less playful than before. There was still joy within them, but there was also longing. As though he searched for something he had not yet found. Perhaps every young heart carries such music, the hope that somewhere beyond the next hill, beyond the next village, beyond tomorrow, someone is waiting, someone whose footsteps are already moving quietly toward your own. The old women of the valley sometimes exchanged knowing smiles. They had lived long enough to recognize this invisible season. There comes a time when spring is no longer only a season upon the hills. It becomes a season within the heart. Orpheus did not yet know the name Eurydice. He had never seen her face. He could not imagine how completely one meeting would change the course of his life, for now the world remained peaceful. The vineyards continued to grow. The forests whispered in the afternoon wind. The rivers reflected slow-moving clouds, and somewhere beneath the endless blue sky of ancient Greece, a young musician continued listening to a world already filled with quiet songs. He did not know that every peaceful day was carrying him gently toward a story that would be remembered for thousands of years. But tonight, there is no need to hurry there. The road is still long. The evening air is cool. The stars are only beginning to appear. And somewhere in the distance, almost too softly to hear, the first notes of a simple lyre drift across the sleeping hills. Morning arrived slowly in the valley. It always had. Before the first rays of sunlight touched the rooftops, the air was cool enough to carry the scent of damp earth from the fields. Tiny drops of dew rested on blades of grass, catching the earliest light like scattered pieces of glass. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster announced the beginning of another ordinary day. The sound was answered by another, then another. Soon the valley awakened, not with noise, but with gentle routine. Smoke rose from stone chimneys. Wooden doors opened one after another. Sandaled footsteps echoed softly across narrow streets worn smooth by generations of travelers, merchants, farmers, and children. No one hurried. The people of this valley had learned something that is easily forgotten. The earth would not grow crops more quickly because a man walked faster, so they worked steadily, patiently, as their parents had done and as their grandparents had done before them. Orpheus often rose before the village itself. He preferred those quiet moments when the world seemed undecided between night and day. At that hour, even birds had not yet begun their morning songs. The hills rested beneath a pale silver mist, and the river moved almost silently through reeds that swayed with the gentlest breeze. He would carry his lyre across his shoulder and leave without speaking, not because he wished to avoid others, but because silence itself had become a trusted companion. The narrow path leading into the hills was familiar beneath his feet. He hardly needed to watch where he stepped. The stones remembered him. The old oak trees seemed to recognize his passing. Every bend in the trail revealed another quiet corner of the valley. There were places where wild lavender covered entire slopes, filling the morning air with a sweet fragrance. There were hidden springs where water emerged from cracks in ancient rock, flowing into shallow pools so clear that every pebble on the bottom could be counted. There were groves of olive trees planted so long ago that no living person remembered who had first placed them there. Their twisted trunks carried the marks of countless winters, yet every spring they produced fresh leaves once again. Orpheus admired them. They seemed to understand patience better than any philosopher. He would often sit beneath their branches without playing a single note. Listening was still the greater part of music. One morning, an elderly shepherd found him there. The old man greeted him with a nod before settling onto a nearby stone. Neither spoke for several minutes. There was no discomfort in the silence. Eventually, the shepherd smiled. "You always come here before the sheep." Orpheus returned the smile. "They arrive exactly when they mean to." The old man laughed quietly. "A good answer." He watched the valley below. "When I was your age, I thought life would become larger every year." He picked up a small pebble and rolled it thoughtfully between his fingers. "Instead, I discovered that the important things were always here. The breeze stirred the olive branches overhead. Orpheus looked toward the distant vineyards. The valley. The shepherd shook his head. No, the mornings. After saying this, he stood, called softly to his flock, and continued along the hillside until both man and sheep disappeared beyond the next rise. Orpheus remained beneath the trees. He thought about those words often in the years that followed. The mornings. Simple things. Easy to overlook. Ancient Greece admired great heroes, warriors, kings, sailors who crossed impossible seas, poets who composed verses that would outlive generations. Yet ordinary people understood another kind of greatness, the ability to notice small moments. The warmth of fresh bread, the cool shade beneath a fig tree, the sound of distant waves reaching the shore at sunset. Perhaps this was why festivals were never hurried. Even celebrations moved gently. As summer approached, preparations began throughout the valley. Families repaired long wooden tables that had been stored away since the previous year. Children gathered flowers to weave into wreaths. Clay cups were washed beside the river until they shone in the afternoon light. Women prepared honey cakes flavored with herbs collected from nearby hills, large baskets filled with olives, grapes, figs, almonds, and fresh cheeses slowly accumulated inside cool stone houses. Every household contributed something. No invitation was required. The festival belonged to everyone. On the morning it finally arrived, the village looked transformed. Bright ribbons fluttered between olive trees, fresh greenery decorated doorways. Musicians tuned their flutes, drums and lyres beneath an open pavilion built from smooth cedar beams. The scent of roasted lamb drifted through the streets. Children chased one another between market stalls while older villagers laughed from shaded benches. Travelers arriving from neighboring towns paused at the entrance. Even before speaking to anyone, they sensed the peaceful atmosphere. This valley welcomed guests without ceremony. Hospitality was one of the oldest customs in Greece. A stranger who shared your table today might be the one to shelter your own family tomorrow. No one wished to offend the gods by refusing kindness. By midday, the celebration filled every corner of the village. Merchants displayed carefully painted pottery. Weavers unfolded colorful cloth. Blacksmiths polished bronze tools until they reflected the summer sun. Storytellers gathered small circles of listeners beneath broad fig trees. Some spoke of distant islands, others retold familiar myths that everyone already knew, yet no one seemed to mind hearing them again. A good story grows comfortable through repetition, like an old path through familiar woods. As afternoon slowly softened into evening, conversations turned toward a single question. Would Orpheus play tonight? Of course he would. Still, people asked. Traditions become traditions because they are anticipated. The musicians assembled near the center of the square. Several flutists began with lively melodies. A drummer kept steady rhythm, while dancers stepped gracefully across worn stone. Laughter rose into the warm evening air. Children clapped. Older couples smiled, remembering dances they had learned decades earlier. Then, almost without anyone noticing exactly when, the music changed. The louder instruments became quiet, one by one, until only a single lyre remained. Orpheus sat beneath an old plane tree whose broad branches stretched across the square. Golden light filtered through its leaves. The first evening stars had begun appearing above the mountains. He placed his fingers upon the strings, No grand announcement followed, no dramatic introduction, only a single note. Clear, gentle, patient. Another followed, then another. The melody unfolded slowly, as though it had been waiting inside the evening itself. People gradually stopped moving, not because they were instructed to, because they wished to listen. A little girl rested her head against her mother's shoulder. An old fisherman removed his hat. A merchant who had intended to leave before sunset quietly sat back down upon a stone wall. Even the nearby horses lowered their heads. The village square seemed somehow larger than before, not physically, but emotionally, as though the music created room inside every heart. No one spoke. Words would have been unnecessary. The melody carried memories without naming them. The warmth of childhood summers, parents whose voices had grown quiet with time, friends who had traveled far away, the feeling of returning home after a long journey. Everyone heard something different, yet somehow everyone heard the same song. When the final note faded into the evening air, silence remained for several moments. Not awkward silence, grateful silence. Then life slowly returned. People smiled at one another. Conversations resumed. Children began laughing again. Someone placed a loaf of warm bread beside Orpheus without saying a word. Another quietly filled his cup with watered wine. Such gestures needed no explanation. Music, like bread, nourished those willing to receive it. As darkness settled over the valley, families carried lanterns through winding streets toward their homes. The stars multiplied overhead until the entire sky seemed filled with distant fires. Orpheus remained beneath the old tree long after the square had emptied. His lyre rested across his lap. He watched the constellations slowly climb higher above the mountains. Somewhere beyond those hills, beyond forests, beyond rivers, another life was quietly unfolding. Another village, another family, another young woman whose path had not yet crossed his own. The night knew her name. The stars looked upon her. The wind had already carried the same summer fragrance past both their homes. Yet they remained strangers for only a little while longer, far away, beneath another sky filled with the same patient stars. Eurydice walked home through a meadow scented with wild flowers, entirely unaware that somewhere beyond the dark hills, a musician had just played the song that would one day lead him to her. Their stories had not yet become one, but the ancient world had already begun drawing their paths together, quietly, patiently, as rivers always find the sea. The ancient roads of Greece were not always made of stone. Many were little more than narrow paths pressed into the earth by countless generations of feet. Shepherds had walked them, merchants had guided their donkeys along them, children had run across them without shoes, travelers had followed them simply because someone else once had. They curved gently around hills. They crossed quiet streams. They disappeared into forests before emerging once more beneath the open sky. One such road led toward another peaceful valley, only a day's walk from Orpheus's home. It was neither wealthy nor famous. Few poets ever wrote about it. Few kings ever visited, and that suited its people perfectly. Life there unfolded with the same patient rhythm as the changing seasons. At dawn, smoke rose from low stone cottages. By midday, fields shimmered beneath the warm Greek sun. In the evenings, neighbors gathered outside their homes, where cooler air drifted down from the nearby hills. There they shared bread, Olives, figs, and stories that had been told so many times, no one remembered who had first spoken them. Among the people of this quiet valley lived a young woman named Eurydice. Unlike the heroes whose names filled epic poems, she possessed no magical gifts. She was not the daughter of a king. No oracle had spoken of her future. No prophecy followed her footsteps. To those around her, she was simply kind, and sometimes kindness leaves a deeper memory than greatness. Each morning, Eurydice walked beyond the village carrying a woven basket across one arm. Sometimes she gathered herbs that grew along rocky slopes, sometimes wildflowers, sometimes fresh mint beside cool streams. The older women often asked for her help because she recognized dozens of useful plants by sight alone. She knew which leaves eased a fever, which flowers could be dried for tea, which roots were best left untouched. Her grandmother had taught her many years before, patiently, one lesson at a time. "The earth always tells us what it offers," the old woman would say. "We simply have to learn its language." Perhaps that is why Eurydice often preferred quiet places. Among the hills there were no unnecessary words. The wind spoke enough. On many mornings she visited a meadow that lay hidden beyond a small grove of cypress trees. It was not large, only a gentle clearing where sunlight lingered longer than anywhere else nearby. Wild poppies swayed beside pale daisies. Purple irises stood among tall grasses. Bees wandered lazily from flower to flower without haste. Butterflies floated through warm air as though carried by invisible currents. It seemed almost forgotten, a place where time moved more slowly. There, Eurydice would kneel among the flowers. She never gathered more than she needed. Ancient Greeks understood that every field belonged partly to the gods. Taking too much was considered both foolish and disrespectful. So she picked carefully, leaving beauty behind for tomorrow. Sometimes she paused simply to watch the clouds. Their slow journey across the blue sky reminded her that not every moment required purpose. Nearby, an old tortoise wandered through the grass. It appeared every few days, always moving, always in the same unhurried manner. Eventually she began speaking to it as though it were an old acquaintance. "You're late today." The tortoise offered no reply. It never did. Still she smiled. Solitude rarely felt lonely when shared with nature. By midday, the warmth of the sun encouraged birds into constant song. Larks circled high above the fields. Swallows darted gracefully through the air, chasing insects too small for human eyes to notice. Even the cicadas joined the chorus, filling the hills with their steady rhythm. Many visitors considered their voices loud. The villagers hardly noticed them. One grows accustomed to familiar sounds, just as one forgets the ticking of a household clock. Returning home each afternoon, Eurydice often passed the village well. It served as far more than a place to collect water. News traveled there. So did laughter. Children gathered around its cool stone walls while mothers exchanged recipes, advice, and stories carried by passing travelers. One afternoon, an elderly merchant stopped beside the well after arriving from a distant town. His sandals were dusty. His cloak showed signs of many journeys. The villagers welcomed him with water and fresh bread. Hospitality, after all, was among the oldest Greek customs. Once he had rested, someone naturally asked whether he had heard any interesting news. The merchant smiled. "There is a young musician in the north." Several villagers nodded politely. "Travelers often exaggerated," the merchant continued. They say wild birds gather around him. Someone laughed softly. Another raised an eyebrow. And dear. The laughter grew, and rivers seem quieter when he plays. Now everyone smiled openly. Children listened with wide eyes. Old men shook their heads with amused disbelief. The merchant shrugged. I only repeat what I've heard. What is his name? Asked a baker, Orpheus. The name settled gently into the afternoon air. It meant little to anyone, only another story carried by another traveler. Before long, conversation drifted toward harvests, weather and road conditions. Life resumed, yet names have curious ways of lingering. That evening, as Eurydice arranged freshly gathered herbs upon wooden shelves inside her home, she found herself quietly repeating it. Orpheus. Not because she expected to meet him, simply because unfamiliar names often stayed in the mind for a little while. Outside, evening settled peacefully across the valley. Lanterns appeared one by one. The scent of baking bread drifted between stone houses. Somewhere nearby, someone played a simple reed flute while children chased one another through narrow streets until darkness finally persuaded them indoors. High above, the stars emerged with patient certainty. They had watched countless generations. Kings had risen beneath those stars. Empires had fallen beneath them. Yet the stars themselves changed very little. Perhaps that is why the Greeks trusted them. They reminded people that not everything in life was temporary. Before sleeping, Eurydice stepped outside once more. The night air was pleasantly cool. She looked toward the northern hills, though she could not have said why. Beyond them lay villages she had never visited, people she would never know, roads she had never walked. Among those unseen places, another young soul stood beneath the very same sky. Orpheus, too, had stepped outside before retiring for the night. His lyre rested against the doorway of his home. He listened to the chorus of crickets filling the darkness. Far away, beyond forests and valleys, someone else was looking upward at the stars. Neither knew the other existed. The distance between them was not measured only in miles. It was measured in ordinary days, still waiting to unfold. Tomorrow would seem much like today. There would be bread to bake, sheep to guide across the hills, water to collect, songs to practice, flowers to gather, nothing extraordinary. Yet history often hides inside ordinary mornings. No thunder announces the day that changes a life forever. No oracle whispers into every waiting ear. Most destinies begin quietly, with a familiar road, a pleasant afternoon, a simple decision to take one path instead of another. As the moon climbed higher above the sleeping valleys of Greece, a cool breeze wandered through the wildflowers where Eurydice had spent her morning. It continued northward across wooded hills, across rivers, across vineyards, until just before dawn it reached the open window beside which Orpheus still slept. The same breeze touched them both. The same stars watched over them. The same ancient land carried them, slowly and patiently, toward a meeting that neither could imagine. For now, however, there was only silence, only peaceful sleep, only another gentle sunrise waiting beyond the horizon. Several weeks passed in ancient Greece. Weeks rarely announced themselves. They arrived quietly, one sunrise after another, each carrying familiar tasks. The vineyards grew a little greener. The figs became a little sweeter. The evenings lingered a little longer before darkness settled across the hills. The people noticed these changes without speaking of them. There was no need. Life itself was a conversation between the earth and the seasons. As summer approached its fullest warmth, preparations began across many neighboring valleys for one of the most anticipated celebrations of the year. The Festival of Apollo. Apollo, lord of sunlight, healing, poetry, and music, was honored throughout Greece in different ways. Some towns held athletic contests. Others offered prayers beside ancient temples. Some gathered poets. Others welcomed musicians. The valley where Orpheus lived had never been the largest gathering place. Yet travelers often came because they had heard stories, not only of the festival, but of the young musician whose melodies seemed capable of calming the heart. By the week before the celebration, the roads leading into the valley had grown busier than usual. Families arrived carrying woven baskets balanced carefully upon donkeys. Merchants guided small carts filled with painted pottery, olive oil, colorful fabrics, and bronze tools. Children walked beside their parents, pointing excitedly toward unfamiliar hills. Every traveler was greeted with the same kindness: fresh water, a place to rest, directions if needed. Hospitality was among the oldest promises of Greek life. One never knew whether a stranger might someday become a friend, or whether the gods themselves traveled the roads in humble disguise. The village square slowly transformed. Wooden stalls appeared one by one. Long tables were built beneath rows of olive trees whose branches provided welcome shade from the afternoon sun. Fresh flowers decorated doorways. Garlands of ivy and laurel stretched between stone buildings. Even those who owned very little found small ways to contribute. Someone polished old lanterns. Another repaired broken benches. Children collected smooth white stones from the river to line the pathways leading toward the festival grounds. Every pair of hands found useful work. The evening before the celebration, Orpheus walked alone beyond the village. He carried his lyre as always, not because he intended to practice, simply because it felt natural. The hills were unusually quiet, perhaps because so many visitors had already arrived, perhaps because even the birds sensed that tomorrow would bring many voices. He climbed to a familiar overlook where the valley spread beneath him. Small fires flickered outside distant homes. Smoke drifted lazily upward into the cooling evening air. Somewhere below, laughter carried faintly through the stillness. Orpheus sat upon the same weathered stone where he had rested countless times before. He adjusted one string of his lyre, then another. He played only a few notes, nothing elaborate. Simple chords that blended easily with the wind moving through the pine trees. When the final note faded, he smiled quietly. The silence afterward felt complete. Sometimes music existed not to fill silence, but to reveal it. Far away, another traveler was approaching the valley. Eurydice had never attended this particular festival before. Her grandmother had often spoken of it, describing music that continued long after sunset and storytellers whose voices could hold an audience for hours. This year, several families from her village planned to make the journey together. They left before dawn. The road wound gently through forests scented with pine resin. They crossed cool streams where children paused to splash water across their faces. Occasionally they stopped beneath broad oak trees to rest and share bread, cheese, and ripe figs. No one minded the slow pace. Travel itself was considered part of the celebration. The destination could wait. By late afternoon, the valley finally appeared beyond the hills. Even from a distance it seemed welcoming. Small curls of smoke rose into the blue sky. The white stone houses reflected the sunlight. Olive groves surrounded the village like quiet guardians. As they entered, friendly voices greeted them. Water was offered. Directions were given. Children quickly found new companions despite having never met before. It was one of the quiet miracles of festivals. Strangers became familiar by sunset. The following morning dawned clear and bright. Golden light spread slowly across the valley. The sky was almost entirely free of clouds. A gentle breeze carried the scent of rosemary and warm bread through the village streets. Before long, bells began ringing from the small temple dedicated to Apollo, not loudly, simply enough to remind everyone that the day had begun. People gathered naturally. There was no rush. The priests offered simple prayers of gratitude. They thanked Apollo for light, for health, for harvests, for the gift of music that brought people together more gently than any command ever could. Afterward, the festival unfolded at its own peaceful rhythm. Children watched craftsmen shape clay upon spinning wheels. Young men tested their skill with friendly contests of running and discus throwing. Women admired woven cloth dyed in shades of deep blue and crimson. Storytellers gathered listeners beneath large plane trees where cool shadows moved slowly across the ground. Musicians performed throughout the day, a flutist from Corinth, a harp player from Thessaly, a chorus of young singers from a neighboring village. Each performance received warm applause, not because every musician possessed extraordinary talent, but because every offering honored the god of music. As afternoon softened toward evening, word spread quietly through the crowd. Orpheus would soon play. People drifted naturally toward the central square. Some found places upon stone benches, others rested beneath olive trees. Children settled beside their parents, unusually willing to remain still. Even travelers who had intended to continue their journeys another hour decided they could leave tomorrow instead. The evening light became softer. Long shadows stretched across the square. Then Orpheus appeared. He wore no elaborate robes, no golden ornaments, only a simple white chiton fastened neatly at one shoulder. His lyre rested comfortably against his side, polished smooth by years of careful use. He acknowledged the gathering with a quiet nod. Nothing more. He sat beneath the great plane tree, the same tree where generations before him had listened to storytellers, poets, and wandering philosophers. For a few moments he simply looked around. Children, elders, travelers, neighbors, strangers, everyone had come carrying different worries, different hopes, different memories. Music belonged equally to them all. His fingers touched the strings. The first note drifted into the evening air, soft, clear, almost weightless. Another followed, then another. The melody grew slowly, like sunlight spreading across still water. Conversation disappeared. Birdsong seemed farther away. The breeze itself felt gentler. Some listeners closed their eyes. Others watched the musician without blinking. Several elderly villagers smiled to themselves. They had heard these melodies many times before, yet they never sounded exactly the same. Music, they believed, changed with those who listened. Among the gathering stood Eurydice. She had not expected anything unusual. She had heard travelers exaggerate before. People often embroidered stories until truth became difficult to recognize. She listened quietly. 1 minute passed, then another. Gradually she understood why strangers remembered his name. It was not because he played quickly, or loudly, or with impossible skill. It was because every note seemed patient. Each melody left room for silence to breathe. Each pause felt as important as every sound. She realized she had forgotten the busy festival surrounding her, forgotten the merchants, the voices, the movement of the crowd. There was only the music. When at last the final note faded into the evening sky, no one moved. Not immediately. The silence lingered like the final glow of sunset after the sun itself has disappeared. Only then did gentle applause begin. Not thunderous, not overwhelming, simply sincere. Orpheus stood. He bowed his head in gratitude. Then, as quietly as he had arrived, he stepped away from the gathering. Many wished to speak with him. Few did. Something about the peaceful mood discouraged unnecessary conversation. Instead, people resumed the festival slowly. Lanterns were lit throughout the square. Warm bread emerged from ovens. Wine was poured into clay cups. Laughter returned. Music from other musicians drifted into the evening. The celebration continued beneath a sky now filled with countless stars. Eurydice wandered away from the busiest streets. The music still echoed gently in her thoughts. She found herself walking toward the edge of the village, where olive trees overlooked the moonlit fields. She paused beside an old stone wall. The night was wonderfully still. Not far away, another quiet figure had also sought the calm beyond the festival. Neither had planned it. Neither expected company. The distance between them was no more than a few dozen steps. For the first time in their lives, Orpheus and Eurydice stood beneath the same olive trees. Neither had yet spoken. The night held its breath. And somewhere above them, the stars continued their slow journey across the endless sky. The night after the festival was unlike any other night. Not because the stars appeared brighter. They did not. Not because the moon was larger. It was not. The world had not changed. The hills remained where they had always been. The rivers continued their quiet journey toward the sea. The olive trees still moved gently whenever the wind passed through their silver leaves. Yet sometimes an ordinary night becomes important for reasons that are only understood later. At the time, it feels like any other evening, a simple moment, a quiet path, a conversation that could have happened 1,000 different ways, and yet somehow it happened exactly as it needed to. Beyond the festival grounds, away from the lanterns and music, the valley rested beneath the peaceful darkness. The sounds of celebration had grown distant, only occasional laughter reached the hills. A faint melody from a flute wandered through the air before disappearing among the trees. The fires in the village square burned lower. Families slowly returned to their homes. Travelers prepared their blankets beneath covered shelters. The great excitement of the day had begun to settle into memory. Orpheus walked beneath the olive trees carrying his lyre. He often preferred the hours after gatherings ended. During festivals, many voices filled the air. Many eyes watched. Many people expected something, but after everyone departed, there was only the quiet, and in quiet places, he felt most himself. He stopped beside an old olive tree whose trunk had grown wide and twisted through centuries of seasons. Its branches stretched outward like welcoming arms. He placed his hand against the rough bark. The tree had stood there before his birth. It would likely remain long after his footsteps disappeared. There was comfort in that thought. The world was larger than any single life, larger than any single joy, larger than any single sorrow. He sat beneath its branches and rested his lyre beside him. For a while he simply listened, the night insects, the distant river, the soft movement of leaves. Then he noticed something else, footsteps, not hurried, not heavy. Someone walking slowly through the grass. Orpheus turned his head. A figure approached from the edge of the olive grove. It was Eurydice. She had left the festival not long after him. The crowded square had been beautiful, but she had always preferred quieter places. The noise of many conversations could be pleasant. But silence had its own kind of beauty. When she noticed Orpheus beneath the tree, she stopped. For a moment, neither spoke. Not because they were afraid, simply because neither wished to disturb the peacefulness of the night. Finally, Orpheus stood. "Forgive me," he said gently. "I did not expect anyone else to be here." Eurydice smiled. "Perhaps I could say the same." A small silence followed, not an uncomfortable one. The kind of silence shared between people who do not yet know one another, but feel no need to rush. "I heard your music tonight," she said. Orpheus lowered his eyes slightly. "Many people did." "Yes," Eurydice replied, "but not everyone listened." The answer surprised him. He looked at her. "What is the difference?" She considered the question. Listening is when sound reaches the ears. She glanced toward the dark valley, but hearing is when it reaches somewhere deeper. For a moment, Orpheus said nothing. He had spent his entire life surrounded by people who praised his music. They spoke about his skill, his talent, the strange effect his melodies seemed to have on the world. Few spoke about what the music actually meant. "You are a careful observer," he said. Eurydice laughed softly. "I collect herbs and flowers. Observation is necessary. And does the earth speak to you?" The question might have sounded strange from anyone else. From him it seemed natural. She looked toward the meadow beyond the trees. Not with words. The wind moved gently through the branches above them, but with signs. Orpheus smiled. Perhaps that is how music works too. The conversation continued slowly. There was no urgency, no attempt to impress. They spoke as people do when they are not trying to become someone else. Eurydice told him about her valley, the hidden meadow where she gathered flowers, the stream where birds often gathered in the morning. The old woman who had taught her which plants healed and which should remain untouched. Orpheus told her about the forests near his home, the places where he first learned melodies by listening to nature, the quiet hills where he practiced when he was still a child. They discovered they shared a similar way of seeing the world. Both noticed small things. Both valued peaceful moments. Both believed there was wisdom in places where others saw only ordinary life. The moon continued its slow journey above them. Eventually, the festival lights behind them became fewer. The valley grew quieter. Neither noticed how much time had passed. That was often how meaningful moments felt. They did not announce themselves. They simply arrived. At last, Eurydice looked toward the village. "My family will wonder where I have gone." Orpheus nodded. "Mine probably already does." They both smiled. A small, simple smile. The kind that appears when two people understand something without needing to explain it. Before leaving, Eurydice paused. "Will you play again tomorrow?" Orpheus looked at his lyre. Perhaps. She looked slightly amused. Perhaps, he smiled. I play when there is something worth saying. And tonight, he looked toward the olive trees, toward the quiet valley, toward the stars above. Tonight, he said, there was. Eurydice walked back toward the village. Orpheus watched until she disappeared among the shadows. Then he remained beneath the olive tree for a little longer. The night felt different, not louder, not brighter, simply fuller, as though some missing piece had quietly found its place. In the days that followed, their paths crossed often, not through grand plans, not through promises, simply through ordinary moments. A walk beside the river, a conversation beneath a shaded tree, a shared meal during another warm evening, the kind of moments that rarely appear in songs. Yet perhaps they are the moments that matter most. People often remember great events, battles, discoveries, victories. But a life is usually built from smaller things, a familiar voice, a hand reaching out, someone who understands the silence between words. Orpheus and Eurydice did not fall in love in a single instant. Their affection grew like an olive tree, slowly, quietly, root by root, season by season. They learned each other's habits, the expressions that appeared before laughter, the thoughts left unfinished, the small worries hidden behind smiles. They learned the comfort of simply being near one another. And the valley noticed. Villagers who had known Orpheus for years saw a new softness in him. His music changed. The melodies remained beautiful, but now they carried something warmer, something less like a question, more like an answer. Even the oldest villagers smiled knowingly. They had seen this before. They knew that when a person's heart finds peace, the world around them often becomes gentler too. The days continued. The seasons moved. The rivers flowed. And beneath the endless Greek sky, Orpheus and Eurydice built a happiness that seemed almost too quiet to be noticed. Perhaps that was why it felt so precious, because neither of them knew how short some beautiful things can be. Neither knew that happiness, like a song, is not measured only by how long it lasts. Sometimes it is measured by how deeply it is remembered. And for now, there was no darkness ahead, no journey beneath the earth, no impossible task waiting beyond the horizon. There was only sunlight, only laughter, only two people walking together through a valley of olive trees, and the gentle music of a life that had finally found its harmony. There are moments in life when everything seems to settle into its proper place. The mornings feel familiar, the evenings feel peaceful. The people around us seem exactly where they should be, and during such times, it becomes easy to believe that happiness is something permanent. That once found, it will simply remain. Orpheus and Eurydice lived through such a season. Not a season marked by great events, not one that poets would immediately choose to write about. It was something quieter, something more precious. It was the season of ordinary happiness, the kind that exists between two people who have learned how to share the small spaces of life. Their marriage was not celebrated with the grandeur of kings. There were no armies gathered, no golden palaces, no endless speeches. Instead, there were flowers gathered from the hills, friends who traveled to share bread and wine, songs beneath the open sky, and the simple joy of two families becoming one. In the old traditions of Greece, A wedding was more than a promise between two individuals. It was a joining of households, a connection between communities, a moment when the past and future stood together. The women of the village prepared wreaths of fresh flowers. They carried baskets filled with fruit and bread. The elders offered blessings and advice, as elders always do. Some advice was practical, some was mysterious. Some had been repeated so many times that no one remembered who had first spoken it. Be patient with one another. Speak kindly, especially during difficult days. Remember that even the strongest trees bend in storms. Orpheus listened carefully. He had always understood the language of nature. Perhaps that was why he understood these words as well. A tree that never bends eventually breaks. A river that never changes its course eventually dries. Everything living must adapt, even love. Especially love. After the wedding, life continued, and that was perhaps the most beautiful part. Great moments eventually become memories, but ordinary days continue. The sun still rose, the bread still needed to be baked, the fields still needed attention. The animals still needed care. The world did not stop simply because two people had found each other, and they would not have wanted it to. Orpheus and Eurydice built their home near the edge of the valley. It was a modest place. Stone walls, wooden beams, a small garden where herbs grew beside flowering plants. There was a narrow path leading from their doorway toward the nearby woods. In the morning, sunlight entered through the windows and painted the floor with warm golden shapes. In the evening, they often sat outside beneath the stars. They spoke about the day, about things they had seen, about things they hoped to do. Sometimes they spoke for hours. Sometimes they sat together without saying anything. They discovered that silence shared with the right person is not empty. It is full. The villagers noticed changes in Orpheus's music. Before Eurydice, his melodies had often sounded as though they were searching. They wandered through mountains. They followed rivers. They reached toward something distant and unknown. After Eurydice entered his life, the music changed. It became calmer, not because he had fewer questions, but because he had found something worth protecting. His songs began carrying the feeling of home. Travelers who visited the valley spoke of a musician whose melodies seemed different from anything they had heard elsewhere. They described the technical skill, the beauty of the notes, the strange ability to make listeners remember things they had forgotten. But those closest to him understood something deeper. Orpheus was no longer simply playing music. He was sharing gratitude. Every melody became a quiet thank you for the morning light, for the forests, for the rivers, for the person waiting beside him at the end of each day. Eurydice also changed his relationship with the world around him. She reminded him that beauty did not exist only in distant places. It existed nearby. In a cup of water offered after a long walk, in the smell of herbs drying beneath the sun, in the sound of rain against a wooden roof, in the way old friends laughed when remembering childhood mistakes. She had a gift for noticing what others overlooked, and slowly she taught Orpheus to look closer. One afternoon they walked together through the meadow she had loved since childhood. The wildflowers were blooming. The air carried the scent of warm earth and fresh grass. Butterflies moved lazily between the flowers. Eurydice knelt to gather a few herbs. Orpheus watched her carefully. "What are you looking for?" he asked. "Something small?" He smiled. "That describes almost everything you love," she laughed. "Small things are often the ones people need most." She held up a tiny flower. Most people would walk past this without noticing. She placed it gently in his hand. But it still grows. Orpheus looked at the flower, then at her. "You remind me of that." Eurydice raised an eyebrow. "Small?" He laughed softly. "No." He looked across the meadow, quietly important. For a moment, neither spoke. The wind moved through the flowers around them. Somewhere above, a bird called from a distant branch. It was a simple afternoon. Nothing extraordinary happened. Yet years later, if someone had asked Orpheus what he remembered most, perhaps it would have been moments like this. Not festivals, not applause, not the admiration of strangers, just sunlight, a meadow, a voice beside him, a hand holding a small flower. The ancient Greeks often spoke of fate. They believed that every life followed a path shaped by forces beyond human understanding. The gods watched, the Moirai, the fates measured the threads of mortal lives. No person could see the entire pattern. A human being knew only the small section of thread held in their own hands. Orpheus and Eurydice knew nothing of what waited ahead. Why would they? The future does not introduce itself. A peaceful morning does not announce that it will become someone's last peaceful morning. A happy conversation does not reveal that it will be remembered forever. Life simply moves forward, day after day, season after season. And so they continued. They planted flowers. They welcomed friends. They walked familiar paths. They listened to the changing voices of nature. The years did not feel empty. They felt complete. Yet beyond the world they knew, the ancient stories say that unseen forces had begun to turn, not because happiness was a mistake, not because love was undeserved, but because even the most beautiful songs must eventually reach their final note. The Greeks understood this. They knew that beauty and sadness often walked together. A flower was precious because it did not bloom forever. A song was meaningful because it eventually faded. A summer evening felt special because winter would one day return. For now, however, winter was far away. The fields were green. The rivers were full. The house of Orpheus and Eurydice was filled with warmth. And beneath the peaceful Greek sky, two people lived inside a moment they believed would last forever. They were happy. They were together. And they had no reason to imagine that the world was about to ask them for the greatest sacrifice a heart can make. The most important days of a life are not always recognized when they arrive. A person may wake in the morning believing the day will be ordinary. The sun rises in the same place. The birds sing the same songs. The familiar paths remain beneath familiar feet. Nothing seems different, and yet somewhere within those quiet hours, the direction of a life can change forever. The ancient Greeks often spoke of such moments. Moments when mortals walked along paths they had walked many times before, unaware that they were approaching a place where fate was waiting. For Orpheus and Eurydice, that day began gently. Just like many days before it, the morning air was warm. The sky above the valley was clear. A light breeze moved through the olive trees surrounding their home. The garden beside their doorway had begun to bloom. Small flowers opened toward the sunlight. Herbs released their fragrance whenever the wind brushed against them. Eurydice stepped outside early, as she often did. She carried a small woven basket. There were plants she wished to gather before the heat of the afternoon arrived. Orpheus watched her from the doorway. He had seen this simple scene countless times. Eurydice walking toward the meadow, the basket resting against her arm, the sunlight touching her hair, the quiet confidence in every step. There was nothing unusual about it. Perhaps that was what made the memory so painful afterward. The final moments of happiness are rarely marked as final, they simply pass by. Orpheus picked up his lyre that morning. He planned to visit a nearby hillside where he often composed new melodies. Before leaving, he and Eurydice spoke about meeting again later. The kind of conversation couples have every day. Simple words, small promises. I will return before sunset. I will prepare the evening meal. We will walk by the river afterward. Nothing dramatic, nothing that suggested the world was about to change. Eurydice smiled before turning toward the meadow. Orpheus watched her disappear along the familiar path. Then he walked in the opposite direction. Neither looked back. Neither had a reason to. The path to the meadow was one Eurydice knew well. She had followed it since childhood. She knew every curve, every tree, every patch of flowers. She knew where the ground became softer after rain. She knew where small streams crossed between stones. She knew where birds nested among low branches. It was a peaceful place, a place connected with many happy memories. That afternoon, she gathered herbs beneath the warm sun. She moved slowly, carefully. As always, she took only what she needed. The world around her continued its ordinary rhythm. Bees moved between flowers. The wind passed through tall grass. Clouds drifted slowly across the sky. Nothing warned her. Nothing announced that this familiar place would soon become part of a story remembered for thousands of years. Ancient stories often speak of the presence of gods and spirits. They tell of unseen forces moving through the mortal world. But to those living inside the moment, events rarely appear as part of a grand design. They appear as accidents, as small turns in the road, as moments when one step follows another. That afternoon, Eurydice heard a sound, not a song, not a voice, something moving through the grass. She looked toward the edge of the meadow. A small creature passed among the plants. The exact details of the old stories differ. Some say it was a serpent hidden among the flowers. Some say it belonged to the wilderness itself. Some say it was simply an unfortunate moment written into the order of things. The Greeks understood that myths could carry many versions. The meaning remained even when details changed. Eurydice stepped back. The world seemed to pause. A breath held between one moment and the next. Then everything changed. The meadow that had always represented life and growth became a place of sudden sorrow. The flowers remained. The trees remained. The river continued flowing. The sun continued crossing the sky. Nature does not stop when a human heart breaks. That is one of the hardest truths of the world. The earth continues. The seasons continue. The stars continue, even when someone's entire world has fallen apart. When Orpheus returned later that day, he carried new melodies in his mind. He had spent hours beside the hills, listening to the wind and shaping sounds into songs. He imagined sharing them with Eurydice. He imagined her smile, her quiet observations, the way she always noticed details he had missed. He walked home without concern. The path was familiar. The evening light was beautiful. Birds called from the trees. Everything seemed exactly as it should be. Until he reached the house. Until he saw the silence. There are silences that feel peaceful. And there are silences that feel wrong. This was the second kind, the kind that makes the heart understand something before the mind accepts it. Orpheus called her name. No answer came. He searched the garden, the rooms, the paths nearby. At first he searched calmly, because people often refuse to believe what they fear most. They look for another explanation, another possibility, another reason. But eventually the truth found him. The world became smaller. The valley disappeared. The sounds of evening faded. There was only one thought. Eurydice was gone. The person who had made ordinary days feel complete. The voice that had brought peace to his music. The hand that had held flowers beneath the summer sun. Gone. The stories say that even the gods were moved by the grief of Orpheus. And perhaps this was because his sorrow was not the sorrow of someone who had lost wealth or power or reputation. It was the sorrow of someone who had found something precious and then watched it disappear. For many days Orpheus wandered. The lyre that had once brought joy now carried only sadness. The same instrument, the same hands, the same musician. Yet everything had changed. The forests heard different songs. The rivers heard different songs. The valleys heard different songs. Animals that once gathered in curiosity now approached quietly. Not because they understood death as humans did, but because grief itself has a sound without words, a sound that can be felt. The villagers who had once celebrated Orpheus's music now listened with heavy hearts. They had no advice, no words that could repair what had happened. Sometimes love leaves a person beyond the reach of ordinary comfort. There are wounds that cannot be healed by explanation. Only time can sit beside them, and even time does not always close them completely. Yet beneath all sorrow, one thought remained alive inside Orpheus, one impossible hope. The Greeks believed that the world of the dead was not an empty place. Beyond the visible world existed another kingdom, a place beneath the earth where souls traveled after leaving their mortal lives, the realm of Hades, a place from which no living person was meant to return. But Orpheus had spent his entire life believing in the power of music. He had seen it calm storms within human hearts. He had seen it bring strangers together. He had seen it create moments that seemed impossible. Now, standing alone in the quiet valley, he wondered a question no living person had dared to ask. Could music reach even the dead? Could a song travel where footsteps could not? Could love cross the boundary between two worlds? The answer seemed impossible, but grief often gives people the courage to attempt impossible things. And so, beneath the endless sky of Greece, Orpheus made a decision. He would not simply mourn Eurydice. He would search for her. He would follow the road no living person wished to walk. He would descend into the darkness beneath the earth, not with weapons, not with armies, not with the strength of a warrior, only with a lyre and a song. The journey to the underworld was about to begin. The decision had been made, but decisions, even the most powerful ones, do not immediately change the world around us. The morning after Orpheus chose to search for Eurydice, the valley looked exactly as it always had. The sun rose above the hills. The birds moved through the branches. The river continued its endless journey toward the sea. The flowers opened beneath the warmth of the day. Nature did not know that a man had chosen to walk toward the impossible. Or perhaps nature knew but remained silent. The world often does this. It allows people to carry their greatest joys and deepest sorrows beneath the same sky. Orpheus spent his final morning among the familiar places of his life. He walked through the garden beside his home. The flowers Eurydice had planted were beginning to bloom. He touched the leaves gently, not because he believed they could speak, but because they carried memories. A garden is never only a collection of plants. It is also the hands that cared for it, the mornings spent beside it, the conversations held nearby, the seasons witnessed quietly from the same patch of earth. He entered the house. Everything remained where it had been. A woven cloth folded carefully, a small basket used for gathering herbs, a cup left on a wooden table. Ordinary objects. Yet grief changes the way we see ordinary things. The smallest items become precious. A person can hold an entire lifetime inside a single object. Orpheus took his lyre, the same instrument that had accompanied him since youth, the same strings that had once filled festivals with joy. Now they would accompany him into darkness. Before leaving, he stood at the doorway for a long time. He looked back once, not because he doubted, because saying goodbye to a place is difficult when so many memories live within it. Then he closed the door and began walking. The road south was long, longer than any road he had traveled before. He did not follow the paths used by merchants or travelers. He searched for older paths, paths mentioned in ancient stories, paths leading toward places where the boundaries between worlds were believed to become thin. The Greeks knew many entrances to the unknown, caves hidden within mountains, deep valleys where sunlight rarely reached, dark rivers flowing beneath stone, places where the world above seemed to whisper to the world below. Orpheus walked alone. At first, the road was familiar. Fields, forests, small villages, streams crossing beneath wooden bridges. People he passed sometimes recognized him. Some offered food. Some offered a place to rest. Many asked where he was going. He rarely answered. How could he explain? How could he tell a stranger that he was searching for someone who no longer walked beneath the sun? Some would think him foolish. Others would think him broken. Perhaps both were true, but love has never required permission from reason. As days passed, the landscape changed. The fields became less frequent. The forests grew older. The mountains rose higher. The paths became narrower. The air became cooler. The songs of birds became distant. Eventually, Orpheus reached places where even travelers rarely went. There, the world seemed quieter, not empty, just quieter. Ancient places often carry a different kind of silence. A silence built from time. A mountain that has stood for thousands of years does not need to speak loudly. A river that has carved stone for generations does not need to announce its strength. The world below was waiting. Orpheus felt it, not as fear, as a presence. One evening he rested beside a small fire beneath a rocky overhang. The stars appeared above him. The same stars he had watched from his home. The same stars Eurydice had seen. For a moment, the distance between them felt smaller. He imagined her looking upward. He imagined her asking why he had not yet given up, and he answered silently, because some bonds do not end when a heartbeat stops, because some promises are stronger than impossibility, because love, once truly known, changes the person who experiences it forever. The following morning he continued. Eventually, he reached a place where the landscape seemed to change completely. The air became still. The trees grew twisted and ancient. A faint mist moved across the ground. The sunlight above remained visible, but somehow felt farther away. The stories of the Greeks spoke of such places, thresholds, places between one thing and another, between land and sea, between waking and dreaming, between life and death. Orpheus stood there with his lyre in his hands. For the first time during his journey, he felt the weight of what he was attempting. The world of the living had rules. The dead had their own. No mortal simply entered the realm of Hades. No living person walked into darkness and returned unchanged. The boundary existed for a reason, yet he continued, step by step. The entrance appeared not as a magnificent gate, not as a place covered in gold or guarded by armies. The ancient stories often imagined the greatest mysteries differently, quietly, hidden, almost unnoticed. A narrow passage, a forgotten path, a place where shadows seemed deeper than they should. Orpheus approached. The air grew colder, his footsteps echoed against stone, the sounds of the living world faded behind him, the warmth of the sun, the movement of leaves, the distant voices of humanity, all slowly disappeared. He had entered a place where the usual measures of life no longer mattered. Time felt different. Distance felt different. Even silence felt different. Yet he carried one thing from the world above: music. He lifted his lyre, not to challenge the darkness, not to defeat it, but to introduce himself. The first note traveled into the underground passage. It moved through stone, through shadows, through forgotten spaces where no human voice had spoken for ages. And something unexpected happened. The darkness listened, far away. Unseen beings paused. The souls wandering through the quiet realm noticed a sound unlike any they had heard before. It was not a command, not a cry, not a warning. It was a reminder of sunlight, of forests, of rivers, of the world they had left behind. The song carried memories, the feeling of warm mornings, the sound of loved ones laughing, the peacefulness of sitting beneath an open sky. The dead remembered, and even the dead could feel longing. Orpheus walked deeper, the path continued downward, the shadows became thicker, yet the music remained. His fingers moved across the strings. Each note carried the name of Eurydice, not spoken, not shouted, simply felt. At last he reached the banks of a dark river. The waters moved slowly, almost silently. Across the shore stood a small boat, and beside it waited its ancient keeper, Charon, the ferryman of the dead. For countless ages, he had carried souls across the waters that separated the world of the living from the kingdom beyond. He had seen kings, warriors, children, the wealthy, the forgotten. All eventually came to the same shore. All eventually required the same journey. He looked at Orpheus, a living man, standing where no living man should stand. For a long moment neither spoke. Then Orpheus lifted his lyre. The music began. The river became still. The mist slowed. The ferryman listened, and for the first time in countless years, the boat waited. The waters of the river moved slowly, almost silently. There are rivers in the world of the living that rush toward the sea with endless energy. They tumble over stones, they sparkle beneath sunlight. They carry leaves and branches along their journey. But this river was different. The Greeks called it the Styx, a boundary, a separation, a place where one world ended and another began. Its dark waters reflected no sky, no clouds, no stars, only the quiet surface of a river that had carried countless souls throughout the ages. Beside those waters stood Charon, the ancient ferryman. He had performed the same task for longer than any mortal memory could reach. He had carried kings who once commanded armies. He had carried poets whose songs were forgotten. He had carried farmers whose names were never written. He had carried children whose lives had barely begun. To him, every soul was the same. Every passenger eventually reached the same shore. Every story eventually became silent. The appearance of a living man standing beside his boat should have been impossible. The laws of the world were clear. The living belonged beneath the sun. The dead belonged beyond the river. There were no roads between them, and yet there stood Orpheus, a mortal carrying only a simple lyre, no sword, no armor, no offering of gold, only music. Charon watched him carefully. The ferryman had heard many things, promises from desperate souls, pleading voices, angry demands. But he had never heard anything like the sound that now moved through the darkness. Orpheus did not play to persuade. He did not play to command. He played because grief had become too heavy to carry silently. The melody moved across the river. It reached the mist hanging above the water. It touched the ancient stones along the shore. It passed through the cold air of the underworld. And something changed. The ferryman lowered his gaze. For a moment he was no longer only a guardian of a boundary. He was someone who remembered. Perhaps even he had once known the warmth of the world above. Perhaps even he had once looked toward the sky. The stories do not tell us what Charon thought. They only tell us what he did. He placed one hand upon the oar and allowed Orpheus to enter the boat. The small vessel moved away from the shore. The sound of wood against water was almost the only noise. Almost. Because the music continued, Orpheus sat quietly. The river stretched endlessly around them. Mist covered the distance ahead. Behind him was everything he knew, the forests, the mountains, the house filled with memories, the world where Eurydice had once walked beside him. Ahead waited a kingdom no living person wished to see, yet he did not turn away. The boat traveled deeper into the darkness as they crossed. Orpheus looked into the waters. He saw no reflection of his own face. Instead, he saw fragments, not visions exactly, more like memories. A child laughing beside a river. An old man sitting beneath an olive tree. A young woman holding a basket of flowers, moments from lives that had already ended. The river carried more than souls, it carried stories. When they reached the opposite shore, Charon said nothing. He simply stepped aside. Orpheus walked forward. The path beyond the river was unlike any road in the living world. There were no flowers, no birds, no warm sunlight. Yet it was not empty. The underworld was not imagined by the Greeks as a place of nothingness. It was a place of quiet existence, a kingdom of shadows, a place where memories remained even after bodies had returned to the earth. The souls of the dead moved slowly through the landscape. Some appeared lost in thought. Some seemed to search for something they could no longer find. Some sat in silence, remembering lives that had ended long ago. When Orpheus passed, they turned toward him. They recognized something unfamiliar: life, a living heartbeat, a breath, a presence that belonged to another world. But more than that, they heard the music. The dead gathered slowly, not rushing, not shouting, simply moving closer. A melody from the world above had reached them, and for a brief moment, they remembered what it meant to be alive. A woman remembered the scent of flowers beside her childhood home. A soldier remembered the sound of rain falling upon a roof before he ever saw battle. A sailor remembered the feeling of the sea breeze against his face. A child remembered a song once sung by a parent. The music did not erase their sadness. It did something gentler. It allowed them to remember without being consumed by loss. Even in the underworld, beauty could exist. Even among shadows, a small light could appear. Orpheus continued walking. The path stretched ahead. The souls followed at a distance, not because they expected to escape, not because they believed the rules of death had disappeared. They followed because music had given them something they had forgotten: hope. Eventually, the landscape began to change. The quiet fields of wandering souls faded behind him. The path became wider. Ancient pillars appeared. Stone walls rose from the darkness. The kingdom of Hades was approaching. The Greeks imagined Hades not as a place of flames and chaos, but as a vast and solemn realm, a kingdom with its own order, its own ruler, its own silence. At the entrance stood guardians, creatures and spirits that watched over the boundary between worlds. Among them was Cerberus, the three-headed guardian of the Underworld, a creature whose purpose was not cruelty, but protection. Nothing living entered, nothing dead departed. That was the order of things. When Cerberus saw Orpheus approaching, the great beast became still. The old stories say that even the guardian of the dead was moved by the music. The three heads lowered, the growl faded. The creature that had frightened countless souls rested quietly as the melody passed through the halls. Orpheus continued. The gates opened. Beyond them waited the palace of Hades, dark stone, silent halls, endless shadows, and within that kingdom sat its rulers, Hades, lord of the underworld, and Persephone, queen of the dead. They had ruled there for ages. They had heard every kind of voice, the cries of the frightened, the prayers of the desperate, the silence of those who had accepted their fate. But they had never heard a song like this. As Orpheus approached the throne room, the music traveled ahead of him, through the corridors, through the chambers, through the ancient halls beneath the earth. The shadows themselves seemed to pause. Hades looked toward the entrance. Persephone lifted her eyes, and for the first time in a very long time, the kingdom of the dead waited to hear what a living man had come to say, not with words, with a song. The halls of the underworld had known many sounds. They had known the slow footsteps of countless souls arriving at the end of their journeys. They had known the quiet whispers of memories carried from the world above. They had known the heavy silence that follows the end of a mortal life. But they had never known a sound like this music. Not the music of celebration, not the music of festivals beneath the open sky, not the music played for kings or victories. This was different. This was the sound of a heart carrying something too heavy for words. The notes of Orpheus moved through the great halls of Hades like a gentle wind passing through an ancient forest. They did not force their way forward. They did not demand attention. They simply arrived, and everything listened. The shadows that filled the palace seemed to become still. The spirits who wandered nearby gathered quietly. Even those who had forgotten their own names seemed to remember something. Something warm, something distant, something they had once held beneath the sun. Within the great chamber of the underworld sat Hades upon his dark throne. The ruler of the dead was not as mortals often imagined. He was not a creature of endless anger. He was a guardian of a realm, a keeper of an unavoidable truth. Every living thing eventually reached his kingdom. He did not seek those who arrived. He did not rejoice in their coming. He simply received them. Beside him sat Persephone, queen of the underworld. She had known both worlds. She had walked beneath sunlight. She had felt the warmth of spring. She had also known the quiet depths beneath the earth. More than anyone, she understood the distance between the living and the dead. When Orpheus entered the chamber, he did not stand like a warrior. He did not raise his voice. He did not demand that the laws of the universe change. He simply stood before them with his lyre. A mortal before immortal beings, a husband before those who held the one person he loved most. For a moment, there was silence. Then Orpheus began to play. The melody was not the song of his grief alone. If it had been only sorrow, perhaps it would have been unbearable. Instead, it carried everything. The first morning he had seen Eurydice, the quiet conversations beneath olive trees, the sound of her footsteps returning home, the way she smiled when discovering a small flower hidden among the grass, the peaceful evenings beneath the stars, the ordinary moments that had become the most valuable memories of his life. The song did not describe Eurydice as a possession he had lost. It described her as a person who had brought beauty into the world, and that difference mattered. The underworld listened. The souls listened. The guardians listened. Even Hades, who had heard the voices of countless mourners across endless ages, listened. The music traveled through the great hall. It reached places where sorrow had rested for centuries. It touched the forgotten corners of the kingdom below. And slowly something rare happened. The underworld remembered life. The dead remembered sunlight. They remembered rivers flowing beneath blue skies. They remembered the warmth of another person's hand. They remembered laughter. They remembered love. Persephone looked toward the shadows. She had heard many pleas before. Many mortals had begged. Many had promised anything. Many had tried to bargain with the impossible. But Orpheus had brought no bargain, only truth. His song contained no selfish desire for glory, no wish to defeat death, only a simple longing to hear one beloved voice again, to walk beside one familiar person again, to return one small piece of happiness to the world above. A quiet sadness appeared in Persephone's eyes. She remembered the world of the living. She remembered fields covered in flowers. She remembered the changing seasons. She remembered what it felt like to belong beneath the sun. Perhaps that was why she understood him. Perhaps that was why she looked toward Hades. The ruler of the dead remained silent. The laws of his kingdom were ancient. The boundary between life and death existed for a reason. If every mortal could reclaim those they lost, the order of the world would collapse. The dead would not remain the dead. The living would never accept farewell. The natural cycle would break. But even ancient laws can be touched by extraordinary moments, and Orpheus had created such a moment. At last, Hades spoke. His voice was calm, not cruel, not angry. You ask for what no living person has asked before. Orpheus lowered his lyre. "I ask only for what was taken." Hades looked at him. "Everything taken from the living eventually returns to the earth." Orpheus answered quietly, "I know, and still you came. I had to." The answer was simple. There was no argument against it, because sometimes the strongest reasons are the simplest ones. Hades looked toward Persephone. Neither spoke. But ancient beings do not always need words, they understood. The queen of the underworld had been moved. The ruler of the dead had been challenged, not by force, but by compassion. Finally, Hades made his decision. The great halls became completely silent. Even the wandering spirits seemed to wait. "You may take Eurydice with you." The words echoed softly through the chamber. Orpheus closed his eyes for a moment. A feeling almost like relief passed through him. But Hades continued, "There will be a condition." Orpheus opened his eyes. "She will follow behind you as you return to the world above." The chamber remained still. "You must walk ahead. You must not turn around. Not once. Not until both of you have reached the surface and the light of the living world touches her." The meaning was clear. The journey back would require trust, faith, patience, the very things that grief often takes away. Orpheus understood. He had crossed rivers no living person crossed. He had entered a kingdom no mortal was meant to enter. He had reached the throne of death itself. Surely he could complete one final task. He bowed his head. "I accept." From somewhere beyond the chamber, a presence appeared. A familiar presence. A presence he had traveled so far to find. Eurydice. She stood among the shadows, quiet, peaceful, not as a memory, not as a dream, but truly there. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Orpheus wanted to speak her name. He wanted to run toward her. He wanted to hold her and never let go again. But the condition remained. The journey was not finished. Love had brought him here. Now love required patience. He turned toward the path leading upward and began walking. Behind him, he heard footsteps, soft footsteps. The footsteps of Eurydice, the person he had crossed the boundary of worlds to find, the person he loved, the person he had almost lost forever. The road back had begun, and it would demand more from him than any journey before. Because the hardest moments are not always the moments when we fight. Sometimes the hardest moments are when we must simply trust. The path upward was quiet, quieter than any road Orpheus had ever walked. There were no crowds waiting, no voices calling his name, no music from the world above, only the sound of footsteps, his own, and the footsteps behind him. Those footsteps belonged to Eurydice, the one sound he had crossed mountains, rivers, and the boundary between worlds to hear again. The one sound he had missed more than any song, and now it followed him, close enough to feel, far enough to doubt. Orpheus walked forward, one step, then another. The road through the underworld was long and ancient. The stones beneath his feet had been touched by countless souls throughout the ages. Some had arrived peacefully, some had arrived with fear, some had arrived unwillingly, but no one had ever walked this path in the same way Orpheus did, a living man returning from the kingdom of the dead, a man carrying a hope that seemed impossible. Behind him Eurydice followed. She did not speak. Perhaps she could not. Perhaps words were unnecessary. Perhaps the silence between them was part of the condition. The agreement was simple: walk forward, do not look back, trust. Yet simple things are not always easy. Orpheus had faced darkness. He had crossed the river of the dead. He had stood before Hades. He had watched shadows gather around him. None of those moments had tested him like this, because darkness was easier to face than uncertainty. A monster can be confronted, a river can be crossed, a mountain can be climbed, but doubt is different. Doubt walks beside you. It whispers quietly. It waits. The path stretched upward through the shadows. At first, Orpheus felt only joy. Eurydice was behind him. She was returning. The impossible had happened. The world that had taken her from him was giving her back. Every step was a victory. Every breath was a miracle. He imagined the moment they reached the surface, the first sunlight touching her face, the warmth of the world above, the sound of birds, the smell of flowers, the valley where their life had once continued. He imagined walking home together. He imagined sitting beneath the olive trees again. He imagined playing music while she listened. These thoughts carried him forward, but the deeper they traveled toward the surface, the more difficult the silence became. The underworld was vast. The journey was not measured only by distance. It was measured by patience. The darkness seemed endless. The air remained cold. The walls around them offered no signs of how close they were. There was no sunrise visible, no stars, no change, only the path, only the footsteps. Orpheus began to wonder, was she truly there? The thought arrived quietly, almost unnoticed. Then another followed. What if the footsteps behind him were only an illusion? What if grief had created a beautiful dream? What if the gods had tested him and he had misunderstood? He tried to silence these thoughts. He reminded himself of Hades' promise. He reminded himself of Persephone's kindness. He reminded himself that he had seen Eurydice, not imagined her, seen her. Yet fear does not always listen to reason. Fear speaks a different language, the language of possibility, the language of what if. The path continued. Orpheus heard the soft movement behind him, a step, a pause, another step. The sound became both comfort and torment. He wanted to hear her voice. He wanted reassurance. He wanted to know, but he could not ask. He could not turn. The rule was absolute. Do not look back. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, the people who told him it was impossible, the distance he had traveled, the darkness he had entered. All of it had led to this moment. Not the crossing of the river, not the meeting with Hades, not the song before the throne, this, the final test, trusting when he could not see. The Greeks understood this struggle well. They knew that human beings often suffer most when they stand between hope and fear, when they are almost at their destination, when success feels close enough to touch. That is when patience becomes hardest. The entrance to the upper world was somewhere ahead. The air slowly changed, very slightly, almost too subtly to notice. The cold began to weaken. A faint warmth touched the stones. A distant sound appeared at first. Orpheus thought he imagined it. Then he heard it again. A bird. A living bird. The first sound from the world above. His heart moved faster. They were close, so close. Soon Eurydice would stand beneath the sun again. Soon he could turn. Soon he could see her face. Soon, but the word itself became dangerous. Soon, because when something is almost within reach, waiting becomes even more difficult. The path climbed higher. The darkness began to thin. A faint glow appeared ahead. The entrance. The world of the living. Orpheus felt tears forming in his eyes. He had done it. He had reached the end. Behind him, Eurydice continued walking. He could almost feel her presence. Almost. One more step, then another. The light grew stronger. The sound of the wind returned. The scent of the earth reached him. The living world was waiting. The impossible was becoming real. And yet a final thought entered his mind. A small thought. A human thought. What if? What if she is not there? What if he reached the surface alone? What if the darkness had followed him? What if the gods had changed their minds? The entrance was near. The sunlight was only moments away. The condition remained, do not look back. Orpheus stopped for only a heartbeat, only a moment. But sometimes a single moment can contain an entire lifetime. Behind him was everything he had lost. Ahead was everything he hoped to regain. And between them stood one simple choice. Trust or fear. The world held still. The light waited. The footsteps behind him continued, and Orpheus stood at the edge of two worlds. The entrance was near, so near that Orpheus could feel the difference between the two worlds. Behind him was the kingdom of shadows, the place where voices became memories, where footsteps became echoes, where time moved differently, and the warmth of the sun was only a distant thought. Ahead was the world he knew, the world of green hills and flowing rivers, the world of flowers growing beneath open skies. The world where Eurydice had laughed, where she had walked beside him, where she had once placed a small flower in his hand, and reminded him that even the smallest things could carry great meaning. The light ahead grew stronger. A soft golden glow touched the stone walls. The air changed for the first time in what felt like an eternity. Orpheus felt the warmth of the living world. The birds were louder now. The wind carried the scent of earth and grass. The surface was only moments away. He had almost succeeded, almost, and yet the hardest part remained. The hardest moments in life are sometimes not the moments when we have nothing. They are the moments when we are close to having everything. Because when something is lost, the heart learns to accept absence, but when something is almost returned, the heart begins to hope again, and hope can be fragile. Orpheus continued walking. His feet moved forward. His mind struggled behind him. He listened. The footsteps followed. Soft, quiet, familiar. Every step should have brought peace. Instead, a question grew louder. Was she really there? He hated the thought. He hated that doubt had entered at all. Had he not crossed the impossible distance between life and death? Had he not stood before the throne of Hades? Had he not heard the ruler of the dead grant his request? And still, the human heart does not always obey what the mind knows. Love had brought him into the underworld, but fear had followed him there. The Greeks often spoke about the weakness of mortals, not because humans were without courage, but because even the strongest people carry uncertainty within them. A warrior may face an army, a sailor may cross a dangerous sea, a hero may fight monsters, yet one quiet question can still shake the soul. What if? Orpheus reached the final stretch of the path. The sunlight was no longer distant. It was just beyond the entrance. One more step, then another. He imagined turning only after they had both reached the surface. He imagined seeing Eurydice standing beside him. He imagined her first breath beneath the open sky. He imagined the two of them returning home, a life restored, a song unfinished finally completed. But imagination can also become a temptation, because the mind creates pictures that the eyes cannot confirm, and the heart longs to see what it already believes. Behind him, a footstep, a pause, another footstep, then silence. Orpheus stopped. The silence felt different. For the first time, he wondered if he had lost the sound. Had Eurydice stopped? Was she struggling? Was she still there? 1,000 thoughts appeared at once. Perhaps she needed him. Perhaps something had happened. Perhaps the gods had hidden some final danger from him. The rules felt cruel. The condition felt impossible. How could he walk away without knowing? How could he leave the underworld without seeing the person he had come to save? The entrance was bright before him. The world was waiting, but the darkness behind him held the answer to the only question that mattered. Is she there? Orpheus closed his eyes for one brief moment. He remembered Eurydice's voice. Not from the underworld, from before, from the meadow, from the evenings beneath the stars, from the quiet home they had shared. He remembered her teaching him patience. He remembered her noticing things others ignored. He remembered her saying that small things were often the ones people needed most. Perhaps this was the greatest lesson she had ever given him. Not through words, through silence. Trust. But grief is a heavy companion. And Orpheus was still a man who had lost the person he loved most, a man who had walked farther than any person should walk. A man standing at the edge of a miracle. The heart made its choice before reason could stop it. Slowly, very slowly, Orpheus turned. At first, he saw only darkness. The shadows of the underworld stretched behind him. Then he saw her, Eurydice, standing on the path, beautiful, peaceful, exactly as he remembered. For one perfect instant, the entire world disappeared. There was only her, only the person he had searched for, only the face he had dreamed of seeing again. His heart knew joy before it understood what was happening, because then he saw the truth. She was not yet completely in the light. She stood between worlds, 1 foot in shadow, 1 step away from freedom, and because he had turned, the condition was broken. The ancient law had been clear. She had followed. He had needed to trust, but he had looked. The space between them became unbearable. Orpheus reached toward her. Eurydice, her expression was not angry, not disappointed, only deeply sad, because she understood, perhaps better than he did. She had seen his love. She had felt his journey. She knew he had not turned because he did not care. He had turned because he cared too much. That was the tragedy. His greatest love and his greatest fear came from the same place. Eurydice began to fade, not suddenly, not violently, slowly, like mist disappearing beneath the morning sun. Orpheus moved forward. He tried to reach her, but the distance between the worlds returned. The living world pulled one way, the underworld pulled another. His hand reached toward hers. For one final moment their fingers almost touched. Almost. Then she was gone. The path became empty. The footsteps disappeared. The silence returned. Orpheus remained standing alone between two worlds. He had crossed the river. He had moved the hearts of the dead. He had reached where no living person had ever reached. And still, he had lost her again. The sunlight ahead remained. The world above continued. Birds sang. The wind moved through the trees. The earth carried on. But for Orpheus, everything had changed. He stepped out into the morning, not as a man who had failed. Not exactly, but as someone who had learned the deepest sorrow a heart can know. To find what you love, to hold it for a moment, and to lose it once more. The world above had not changed. That was the first thing Orpheus noticed. The sky was still blue. The rivers still moved. The forests still whispered when the wind passed through their branches. The sun still rose each morning exactly as it always had. The world continued, but Orpheus did not return to it as the same person who had left. Some journeys change the landscape around us, others change only the person who walks them. His journey had done both. He had entered the realm beneath the earth. He had crossed the boundary between life and death. He had spoken before the rulers of the underworld. He had almost brought Eurydice home. Almost. That single word followed him everywhere. Almost. He had almost succeeded, almost touched her hand, almost heard her voice beneath the sunlight again, almost returned to the life they had once shared. But the world of mortals is filled with almosts. People often carry them quietly. The things they nearly said, the roads they nearly took, the moments they nearly changed. For Orpheus, the greatest almost of his life walked beside him every day. When he returned to his valley, people came to meet him. They had heard rumors. They had heard impossible stories. Some believed he had truly entered the underworld. Others thought grief had carried him into a dream. But when they saw his face, they understood something had happened. No explanation was needed. The sorrow of someone who has lost a loved one is sometimes visible before a single word is spoken. His friends welcomed him home. They offered food. They offered shelter. They offered their presence. But there are moments when even kindness cannot reach a person's deepest pain. Orpheus was grateful. He truly was. Yet gratitude did not remove grief. Comfort did not erase absence. A person can be surrounded by love and still miss one particular person more than anything else in the world. He returned to the house he had shared with Eurydice. Every corner carried a memory: the garden, the doorway, the path leading toward the meadow, the places where ordinary moments had once taken place. The world was filled with reminders, and reminders can be both beautiful and painful. He would wake in the morning and briefly forget. For one small moment, before memory returned, he believed she was still there. Then the truth would arrive quietly, again. The ancient Greeks understood that grief was not a straight road. It did not simply become smaller each day. It moved like the sea. Some days were calm, others were filled with waves. Some mornings brought peace, some evenings brought overwhelming sadness. The heart had its own seasons. Orpheus stopped performing at festivals. The songs that once filled villages with joy became too difficult to share. People had loved his music because it brought them closer to happiness. Now every melody carried the memory of someone who was gone. The same instrument, the same hands, a different song. He still played, but he played differently. The music no longer reached toward celebration. It reached toward remembrance. He played for the flowers Eurydice had gathered, for the paths she had walked, for the quiet moments no one else had witnessed, for the small details that only someone who truly loved another person would remember. A stranger might hear sadness, but those who listened carefully heard something else: love. Because grief is not the opposite of love. It is often proof that love existed. A person does not mourn what meant nothing. A person mourns what mattered. Years passed. The valley changed. Children who had once listened to Orpheus during festivals grew older. New generations learned the stories. Travelers still came searching for the musician whose songs had moved even the dead. Some wanted to hear a miracle. Some wanted to meet a legend. But Orpheus had little interest in being remembered as extraordinary. He had never wanted to be famous. He had only wanted a life beside the person he loved. The stories about him grew larger with time. Some said animals followed him everywhere. Some said trees bent closer when he played. Some said even stones moved toward his music. Whether these things were true or not mattered less than what they represented. The Greeks understood that a great song does not belong only to the person who creates it. It belongs to everyone who finds meaning within it. And the song of Orpheus became a reminder that music could cross boundaries, that love could challenge impossible things, that even failure could contain beauty. One evening, many years after his journey beneath the earth, Orpheus returned to the meadow where he and Eurydice had spent so many peaceful hours. The wildflowers had grown again. The trees had grown taller. The stream continued flowing nearby. Nature had continued its quiet work. He sat among the flowers, the same place where he had once watched Eurydice gather herbs, the same place where happiness had seemed endless. He lifted his lyre. For a long time he did not play. He simply listened. The meadow was full of familiar sounds: the wind, the insects, the distant birds, the movement of grass beneath the evening air. He realized something. For years he had searched for Eurydice in the world of the dead, but perhaps a part of her had remained in the world of the living all along, not as a ghost, not as a shadow, but in everything she had touched, the flowers she had cared for, the wisdom she had shared, the patience she had taught him, the way she had shown him that small things mattered. Loss had taken her presence, but it had not taken everything. Slowly, Orpheus began to play. The melody was different from all the others. It was not only sorrow, it was not only longing, it carried acceptance. The understanding that some things cannot return, but they can remain. The sun moved lower, the valley became golden, and the music traveled gently across the meadow. For a moment, Orpheus felt close to peace, not because he had forgotten, but because he remembered without only suffering. The story of Orpheus and Eurydice would continue long after his own footsteps disappeared. People would tell it beside fires. Poets would write about it. Musicians would find inspiration in it. Because beneath the myth of gods and the underworld, there was something deeply human. A person who loved. A person who lost. A person who tried to cross impossible boundaries because saying goodbye felt too difficult. Perhaps that is why the story survived, not because Orpheus succeeded, but because he tried. Because love often asks us to do impossible things. Because sometimes the greatest songs are born from the deepest wounds. And because even after the final note fades, the song can still remain. Time has a quiet way of changing everything. The mountains remain, the rivers continue their journeys, the stars return each night to the same places in the sky. But human lives move like passing seasons. A childhood becomes a memory, a friendship becomes a story, a voice becomes something remembered by others, and eventually even the people who seemed impossible to forget become part of the endless movement of time. Orpheus knew this. Perhaps he understood it better than most. His entire life had been shaped by things that could not be held forever. A melody existed for only a moment before becoming silence. A flower bloomed before fading. A summer evening arrived before becoming autumn. A human life appeared beneath the sun and eventually returned to the earth. The Greeks did not see this as meaningless. They saw it as part of the beauty of existence. A thing does not need to last forever to matter. A song does not need endless notes to be beautiful. Sometimes the final note gives meaning to all the ones that came before. In the years after Eurydice's second departure, Orpheus continued wandering through the lands of Greece. He traveled through forests, across valleys, along the edges of rivers, places where people lived simple lives beneath the ancient sky. Wherever he went, people remembered him. Some remembered the young musician whose songs had brought joy. Some remembered the husband who had challenged death itself. Some remembered only the quiet man carrying a lyre, walking beneath the trees. But those who truly understood his story remembered something deeper. They remembered a person who had loved completely. The world often celebrates victories. It remembers those who conquer, those who build, those who overcome. But there is another kind of courage, the courage to love knowing that loss is possible. The courage to open the heart even though nothing in the mortal world can be kept forever. Orpheus had learned this lesson through suffering, but he had learned it. His music changed once more. The sorrow never completely disappeared. Some wounds become part of who we are, but sorrow was no longer the only thing within his songs. There was peace, there was gratitude, there was understanding. When he played, listeners no longer felt only sadness. They felt connected. They remembered their own lost loved ones, their own forgotten moments, their own quiet joys. His music became a place where memories could rest, a place where the past was not something painful to escape, but something precious to honor. The old stories say that Orpheus's music continued to affect the world around him. They say animals gathered. They say trees leaned closer. They say nature itself listened. Whether these things happened exactly as described is not the most important part. Myths often speak through symbols. The animals represented the wild world recognizing harmony. The trees represented nature responding to beauty. The stones represented even the hardest things being touched by compassion. The meaning was clear. True music does not only entertain, it reveals something. It reminds people of what they already carry inside. Years passed. The musician grew older. His hair became silver. His steps became slower, but his connection with music remained. The same hands that had once played beneath the bright celebrations of youth now moved more gently across the strings. The same heart that had once burned with desperate longing now carried the quiet wisdom of someone who had experienced both the highest joy and deepest sorrow. One evening, Orpheus returned to a familiar hillside. The sun was beginning to disappear. The sky slowly changed colors. The world became quiet. He sat beneath an old tree, perhaps an olive tree, perhaps an olive. the kind of tree that had watched countless generations come and go. He placed his lyre beside him. For a while, he listened. The wind, the distant river, the voices of the earth. He thought about his life, the happiness he had known, the love he had found, the loss he had endured, the impossible journey beneath the earth, the moment when he had looked back. For many years, he had wondered about that moment. He had asked himself the same questions again and again. What if he had waited? What if he had trusted? What if he had taken one more step? But with age came a different understanding. The past cannot be rewritten. A person cannot return to yesterday. The river of time moves only forward. Perhaps the gods had not created the condition to punish him. Perhaps it had revealed something about being human. People are imperfect. Even those who love deeply, even those who are brave, even those who achieve what seems impossible, fear can overcome us. Doubt can overcome us. A single moment can change everything. But one mistake does not erase an entire life. Orpheus had failed to bring Eurydice back. But he had succeeded in something else. He had shown the world how powerful love could be. He had shown that music could reach places where words could not. He had shown that even the boundary between life and death could be touched by the human spirit. The evening grew darker. The first stars appeared. Orpheus lifted his lyre one final time. He did not play for the gods. He did not play for legends. He did not play for strangers. He played for himself, for Eurydice, for the life they had shared, for the moments that had existed and could never be taken away. The melody moved gently across the hillside. No grand audience gathered. No great ceremony surrounded him. Only the earth, only the sky, only the quiet beauty of a final song. And perhaps somewhere beyond the boundaries humans cannot cross, another soul heard it. Perhaps Eurydice remembered, perhaps she smiled. The ancient stories never truly tell us. They leave some things hidden, because some mysteries are more beautiful when they remain mysteries. What matters is that the song continued, not through endless life, not through escaping death, but through memory, through the hearts of those who heard it, through every person who has ever loved someone and feared losing them, through every person who has ever looked back and wished they could change one moment, through every person who has learned that love is precious precisely because it is fragile. The story of Orpheus and Eurydice remained because it was never only about a musician and a lost wife. It was about humanity itself, about hope, about grief, about courage, about the impossible desire to hold on to what we love, and about the quiet truth that even when something ends, it can still leave a lasting song behind. The wind moved through the trees. The stars continued shining above. The final notes faded into the night. And beneath the endless sky of ancient Greece, the song of Orpheus remained. The end.